Quiet on the set, please.
Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
And action!
Welcome to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. If you love old movies, Hollywood history, or the golden age of filmmaking, you've come to the right place. This is the podcast that talks about amazing stories of Tinseltown from another era. Hear fascinating conversations with writer-producer Steve Cubine, who quite literally lives just beneath the Hollywood sign, and actress-writer Nan McNamara. Now your hosts, Steve and Nan.
Welcome, everybody, to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most enigmatic stars of Hollywood, Greta Garbo. And she was a star who defined an era, and then she stepped away mysteriously. And she left behind a legacy that's just as mysterious as it is enduring.
And we are thrilled to welcome a very special guest to talk about her, and that is Scott Reisfield, who is Greta Garbo's great nephew. Now, Scott brings a rare and really deeply personal perspective to her story. In his book, Greta Garbo and the Rise of the Modern Woman, Scott goes beyond the legend and shares insights drawn from family history, personal connection, and years of research, which we will get into. He is also the author, with Robert Dance, of the acclaimed book, Garbo, Portraits from Her Private Collection.
Now, in this conversation, we're going to explore who Garbo was off-screen. We're going to discover how her legacy was shaped, and also, for Scott, what it's like to carry the story of somebody the world thinks it already knows. So, settle in, because we're going to go beneath the myth and maybe a little bit closer to the truth. So, Scott, welcome. We're so glad to have you here today.
I'm excited to be talking to you.
Scott, let's just dive right in. We've got a lot of questions. You write that much of what people know about Greta Garbo is not accurate. And I think that's one of the really fascinating, one of the many fascinating takes in your book. What are seen by you as the biggest myth about Ms. Garbo that you wanted most to dismantle?
I think overall, it's somehow that she was like this naive vessel that just sort of floated into Hollywood. She had talent, but she was very highly trained, and she came with some skills, and was actually amazed at how little Hollywood focused on how she acted. Like, she made up the characters out of her mind, not some director's pointers.
Another thing that you say in the book that I find interesting is that, you know, that you think that she's so unfairly been sort of reduced to just the recluse. Why do you think this version came to be, and who perpetuated that image for her?
Well, I think that, the context of her career in the 30s is this increasingly conservative social environment. Because of the Depression and war. And then after the war, sort of the nuclear fears. America didn't break out of this social conservative era until really the 70s. And she kind of represented the more liberal trend in society with women's rights, women working. So there was a group of people who viewed her, especially if they had watched her in the 30s, as what they were trying to walk away from. And when you get to the 50s and 60s, a lot of people by that time did not know her from movies they had seen. If you were in your 20s or 30s after the war, you may not have seen a Garbo film. You just know Garbo as a celebrity. I think the idea of her being reclusive, it fit a little with her because she was not interested in media and publicity.
Yeah.
But it became sort of a go-to story. And I found it interesting reading what paparazzi wrote about their business, that if they sold a photo to a newspaper, they would get pennies. But if they could craft a narrative about Garbo or other stars, they had sort of a story for each star. And if they could sell that story, they would get thousands of dollars for the same photo. So this just became the Garbo story. It fit with the social conservatism. It was lucrative. And you would get newspapers with a paparazzi story about hiding Garbo, and elsewhere in the same paper, and she returned to New York, with a picture.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And yeah, so I think that was a lot of it.
Yeah.
Some of my favorite photos, and I found two of them, are paparazzi photos with George Schley holding up his hand, and the caption being that Garbo is hiding.
I love that.
That's brilliant.
Well, Scott, in addition to what you just described as the press sort of molding their view of her, biographers also have done that, and in some ways created this passive, mysterious woman, as opposed to somebody who, as you said, is trained, is intentional in her career, in some ways is a true artist. As you said, directors didn't have any idea of how to create a character, and she did. Why do you think that previous biographers minimized her agency so much?
Well, I think there was a part of it, and if you go back to books written in the 50s, that there's just was a general misogyny. The idea that a woman would be managing something just didn't fit with their approach. But I think one of the interesting things with Garbo, and it's, there are things I knew before I started my research, and then there were things I didn't know. And so it was interesting how it all came together to a singular view of her for me, where all the pieces of the puzzle really fit together.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the problems, and I really feel for some of the original biographers, is they would go back and look at magazine articles from the 30s, and they were made up. And
Yes.
Yeah.
that was sort of, I think, not what people expected. It'd be like, well, certainly something written by a childhood friend in 1930 must be somewhat close to true. And it's like, well, if it's an actual childhood friend, if it's a made-up friend, not necessarily.
No, I'm just curious because I find this interesting that from my research, you didn't really know that she was this iconic movie star until much later in your life. What was that revelation like when you discovered, oh, my great aunt is actually this iconic movie star?
Yeah, well, growing up, in the 60s, really, her films were not really shown a lot. I mean, they were shown. You could see them. I did see some. But she wasn't a contemporary star. It wasn't like she was John Wayne or something. And so there wasn't, in some ways, the publicity of celebrity around her for me. And so at some point, I knew she had made movies, but they weren't my movies. And it really wasn't until it had an effect on my life. I mean, I knew that she was someone who had made movies when I was like in middle school, but it wasn't until I was really in college that her celebrity ever intruded directly on my life. She and my mom were in People magazine when they were on vacation down in Barbuda, and I was sitting in calculus class, and another student sat down next to me and said, "I saw your mom in People magazine." and that was the moment at which it became like an issue. But it wasn't even then an issue in the sense that when I started my professional career, I didn't tell people I was related to Garbo, and it wasn't an issue really until the internet made everything searchable.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, that opened up everything.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, my segregation of my life into two sections evaporated.
Yeah.
You can run, but you can't hide, Scott.
Right.
We all find you.
Right.
Yeah.
So can you tell us, Scott, about your mom's relationship with Greta Garbo?
My grandparents were in Sweden, and Garbo spent a fair amount of time in Sweden. She would go for a year almost in between films in the 30s. And they were a very close family. And then in 1939, my grandparents moved to the United States with my great-grandmother, because of the war.
Mhm.
And then they stayed. And so my mom was kind of just part of her life. And there is a point sort of in like 1953 or thereabouts when my mom started law school. And I call Garbo Kata. So if I say Kata, that's who I mean. That was the family name. That's all I ever called her in a conversation with her or in a conversation with my family. And so she made a point of inviting my mother to New York for drinks and moving the relationship to an adult relationship.
Once she was starting law school.
Yeah.
What do you want to drink? Come at 5. And I think there was always this like generational relationship of a parent like to an aunt. So I think for my mom, she was sort of like an extra aunt, where for me, Garbo was sort of like an extra grandparent, which is
Sure.
just a very different relationship. Like
Yeah.
I was never going to have an adult peer relationship with her.
Right.
Whereas my mom sort of did. And we grew up in New Jersey, just outside of New York. And so Kata came out to visit. She would have dinner. They would do whatever things in Swedish that I didn't understand. But there had been, with my grandmother, lots of letters because they were very close. And so even though they weren't physically close all the time, they were always communicating with each other. So there was always this thread going through of people who were close. And so eventually, as my mom became more of an adult friend, they would do things together. They went on like an annual vacation to the Caribbean in the winter for 2 weeks every year from, I don't know, sometime in the 70s on. When later in life she needed help with things, I think my mom was primarily the person she turned to. As she became just older and more frail, it was my mom who would take care of, the accountant or whatever. When she had a heart attack in Switzerland, it's my mom who went over to bring her back to the United States. So they were very close.
Now, one of the things that I loved about your book, and it struck me as probably one of the most important themes, I think, and we kind of touched on it a little bit, but, you say that, we have this idea that Garbo was just discovered out of thin air, when in actuality, it was very intentional on her part. Why was that so important for you to get across that she really worked hard for everything she had?
Yeah. Well, I think she was talented, and that certainly helped. But I think she wanted to be an actor. It was important to her to create roles. And I think that when you look at the planning she did, it frames her out as a professional from a very young age. Right? She was very serious. And in fact, one of the things I didn't know, like the things you don't know, is that in Sweden, back then, the 1920s, a young person would start in sort of like a more casual job when they finished primary school. Like they basically went to school until they were 15, 16 years old. And unless you were upper class, maybe middle class, that was the end of school. But you didn't really begin your real career until your 20s. So you sort of kicked around in these more casual jobs for a couple of years, figuring out what you wanted to do. Well, Garbo did that for like a year. And then she got a job at a department store before she was old enough to have that job. And, that was a very career-like job. And while she's doing this job, she starts working in industrial films. So she's already in films. They're not the same as creative films, but she's getting experience in front of a camera. She knows what lights look like. And then she takes that money and puts it into acting lessons so she can go and apply to Dramaten. So there's this plan that she executes over a year. So, this is what I think is important to understand is Garbo worked at her craft. She worked to put herself in the business position to be able to be an actor. She went to, probably was at the time, the best naturalistic acting school in the world.
Right.
And they loved her. They thought she was fantastic. And then she, gets to work with Stiller and Pabst. And so she arrives in Hollywood pretty much fully formed as an actor, and also with a great understanding of the business of acting in film. She's been picking Stiller's brain. She's friends with Sjöström, who's one of the great directors. And basically, the two of them worked as independent producers in their Swedish career. So they know everything about film. So she really has an idea, a plan of what she wants to do with her characters. A lot of people get there in their careers. I mean, I always find Joan Crawford interesting because she's incredibly successful, but she didn't start with all that. It took her years to build up this idea of what Joan Crawford could be.
Yeah.
Right.
And Garbo was there at 19.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's interesting.
That's such an interesting point, because so many of the people that we cover on the podcast are exactly the opposite. They are plucked out of a beauty contest, or perhaps, seen somewhere and taken to Hollywood, and really don't have the craft. They build it, they get there, but they don't start that way. So that's a really interesting point. One other thing that I think that you talk about in the book that's so interesting is the myth that Garbo came from a very poor background. Can you talk about that myth and why writers created this sort of inaccurate picture of her in that regard?
Sure. Well, she was definitely a working class kid. It's not, the other kids at Dramaten were middle class kids. Most of them had been to high school, had done some acting somewhere else. She was the anomaly there. Partly it's this created sort of myth of Garbo as just sort of happening, right? So you make her childhood as rough as possible.
Yeah.
But she's not had a Charlie Chaplin kind of destitute childhood. So working class family, they had an apartment with a kitchen, which was one of the delineators between really poor and just working class. Like, they cooked. And I think the other thing is, there is some truth. I mean, she had an uncle who I think enjoyed creating stories about her to make himself look good. And one of the things he talked about was, that they couldn't always, put food on the table and things like that. Well, during World War I, nobody in Sweden could put food on the table.
Right.
Right.
A really difficult situation. I don't think I put this in the book, but the average Swede ate less food than the average German, and they were neutral. They just couldn't get anything imported into the country because
Oh wow, yeah, that's true.
There were hunger riots in Stockholm. And I think the other thing, I mean, her father did die. He was sick for a while. But by the time he was sick and died, her two older siblings were in the workforce. So the family had income coming in. I think the other reason, there's this little thing that gets brought out, which is true, but it's a context thing. So her building had outhouses, right? So it's like, well, they were so poor they used outhouses. Well, Stockholm as a city, which is a city of lakes, it took them decades to solve their sewer problems.
Yeah.
So when the building they lived in was built, it was built with outhouses because sewers were not legal. They didn't know what to do with sewer lines.
Oh, that's interesting.
They had outhouses, but
Right.
it was a citywide problem, not specific to just the Garbo family.
Yeah.
Right.
Another cool thing about the book that I found interesting was you talk about her life growing up in Sweden and how that really shaped her worldviews, and it shaped her thoughts on work and independence and even women's rights. How do you think Garbo would have been as a person had she grown up in America?
Well, I think it may have been family dependent. I mean, the Kata nickname is from a women's rights activist, right? So in Sweden. So I think the family believed in what women could do. Her sister Alva worked as a secretary, so she was, at the time, that was a middle-class job. If you were a clerk, that was a good-paying job, but you were also working. My mom went to law school in the 50s, so our family has always had women go out and do stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Love that.
It sounds
Yeah.
like it. You talk about Eric Peschler. Am I saying his last name correctly?
Peschler, yeah.
Peschler. You talk about the famous story about him helping Garbo get into drama school, the National Theater that you just mentioned. What is your take on that story? Can you flesh that out for our listeners?
Yeah, so Garbo was incredibly fortunate in that when she started working at Pub, the department store she worked at, she started in July as sort of an intern. She would step in and do sales when they got busy, and they realized they wanted to keep her in sales. So sometime around her birthday, before or after, she ended up in sales in women's clothing, right? The busy department. And then in December, she gets cast in an industrial film for the department store, which is her big break into film. And then she works in a bunch of industrial films. She is making this plan to apply to Dramaten and hopefully get in. But if she doesn't get in, this I don't know for a fact, but I would surmise her plan B was to go work in the regular theater world. She clearly communicated to her friends that she was going to be an actress. So how and exactly where sort of depended on other people, but she was committed to that path. So she went and she had done a number of different things for Ragnar Ring, the person who started her in industrial films. And Ring wanted to create basically a full-length branded film. So a film that was sold soap, right? They were going to sell, I think, a shoe polish. No, seriously. And it's kind of this interesting story of a dream world, and somehow it ties into shoe polish. I'm not exactly sure how. But,
I love that.
Ragnar Ring went to her boss at the department store and asked to give her 2 weeks off, and he got turned down. Bergstrom said, "No, you can't. You're putting these dreams in her head that she's going to have a career in acting, and she's got a solid job here at Puck."
And she's making us a lot of money, right?
Yeah, she was one of their best salespeople, right? And she's 18 years old.
Yeah.
17. The offer to work in the Viking film is withdrawn, but Garbo wants to do something before she applies to Dramaten. And the timing is not like the normal current application process. So there, for Dramaten, you made your application at the beginning of August. They called you back for an audition at the beginning of September. And school started a week or two after the auditions.
Oh.
Right? You either got in or you didn't. And
Wow.
if you didn't, you were just out of luck, I guess.
Yeah.
You better have had a different backup plan. So that's the timing Garbo went through. What she did when she didn't make the Viking film is she hooked up with this other guy, Eric Peschler, who was about to make a film called Peter the Tramp in English. And she made that film. And what happened from there is Peschler would say that he got her into Dramaten, but there's no time to do that because from when she quit the department store to when the applications were due, and then the auditions is 2 months. And Peschler's story has him filming her, seeing her on the street weeks later, and then hooking her up with the acting coach, who was no longer her acting coach because he was sick. His daughter had taken over the classes, but he pulled all the pieces of Ragnar Ring's story and just put himself in the middle of it. and it's in magazines that way. So when researchers went back to see, well, how did this all happen for Garbo? Instead of her crafting her career, it's, well, Eric Petchler saved her.
Aha.
Ah,
And that's kind of a common theme in the Garbo stories that were crafted about her start in particular, is someone came in and saved her.
Yeah.
yes.
The same thing with Arnold Genthe. Arnold Genthe tells these stories about their photo shoot, which is a fantastic, it turns out, set of photo shoots. I did not originally know that they had 3 different sessions, which in itself was rather uncommon for Genthe. But his story was MGM didn't know what to do with Garbo. She was about to go home. And so he arranged for the photos to come to MGM during a board meeting, is the way he wrote it. And they said, who is this marvelous person? We must hire her. When that is not the story at all.
Well, even jumping back to the theater school, you write about how competitive it was. So for her to have been somehow magically helped by someone else, she had to really get in there on her own merit.
Well, yeah, it was competitive, and especially for women, for guys.
Yes. It's
Usually-
always that way, Scott. It's always
Yeah.
that way.
Very unfair. I tell you, the world has been unfair for generations.
Yes, exactly.
But 2 of the women had already been in films,
Yes.
so she was the unknown part of it. Now, I do think she wasn't totally unknown. She had been taking classes. People were aware that she was out there, and I'm sure people were saying, oh, she's got some skills.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, one thing that you say in the book, Scott, and I think it's a very astute observation, is you really talk about how once Garbo got to Hollywood, she really transformed acting. And because she brought a more naturalistic interior life of acting style to the screen. Now, are there certain movies that you think that is the most evident in?
well, I think it's evident from the torrent. I think it's never
Yes.
not there. I think what's interesting is if you take some of the other stars from that same year and how they do a kiss, or
Yes.
how she's just totally different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're right.
So you can see why that resonance was there.
Yeah.
But she's doing these very subtle things in an environment where all the acting is more over the top. It's the nature of, I think, silent film, that it's easier
Yes.
to be over dramatic because you don't have the words to work with. But she found a way to do it with just subtle movement. I also think it's sort of interesting that, again, things I didn't understand until I did more research. There was this transition in film. There's this ever-evolving clarity of lenses and depth of focus in lenses, which help her. I mean, compared to somebody acting in any kind of film in 1920 to 1925, just the improvement of lenses makes everything.
Sure.
Yes. Yeah.
But there was this switch to panochromatic film. So you get the full color range, and it allows close-ups to work better. And she takes full advantage of that in a way that would have been difficult, 2 or 3 years before. So
Sure.
she's also fortunate as the technology evolves. In fact, by the time she gets to Love, one of the reviewers wishes they had fewer close-ups because they bother.
Oh, no.
That's hilarious.
Well,
This is
and
what he's used to.
yeah. I mean, the thing about her that's so wonderful is, yes, there were more close-ups, but she knew what to do with the close-up.
Yeah.
She had such an internal life, as you so rightly say, a lot of people didn't in that era.
For me, one of the points where my research sort of moved ahead, if you will, and this happened maybe a decade ago. I read the Norman Zierl book on Garbo, and it's really more of an appreciation than a biography. But he went out and interviewed as many people as he could find who had worked with her. And that was what opened my eyes to see what her peers thought of her work.
Mhm.
Yes.
And I went even further than he had. When you see what her contemporaries thought of her ability, her results, they were amazed at the things she could achieve, and her drive.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, oh, I should look at this maybe a little differently.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it was such a competitive time. I mean, Hollywood has always been competitive and always will be, but they didn't have to say what they thought of her in that truthful way. And it's really a testament to what she was able to do as an actress that they were even saying she's really got something.
And what's the famous quote that, is it Louis B. Mayer that says that Hollywood only cranked out one true star, Garbo, except maybe the mouse?
Yeah, I mean, it's totally unfair to Chaplin, who he didn't like, but it's a great quote.
It's
Yeah,
a great quote.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, before we get into more about Greta Garbo, I think it's time for this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
And our pop quiz question today, of course, is going to involve the great Greta Garbo. And the question is, Greta Garbo was the first woman from Sweden to ever be nominated for an Academy Award. Well, since that nomination, there were 4 other Swedish actresses nominated for Academy Awards. Can you name them?
Oh my goodness. That is a great question.
The Nords are in the house.
Okay, yeah, they are. They are. All right, we'll be right back with more about Greta Garbo and Scott Reisfield after this.
Steve and Ann will be right back, but first another stop on the Hollywood tour. Greta Garbo was indeed a real force early in her career. When she was still shooting silent films, she began to require some unusual conditions during the filming of her scenes. In fact, she prohibited visitors, including the studio brass, from even visiting her set. In addition, she demanded that black flats or screens surround her on set. She wanted to prevent extras and technicians from watching her. Why? Well, when asked about these eccentric requirements, she said, quote, "If I am by myself, my face will do things I cannot do with it otherwise." What a face it was. And now back to Steve and Ann from Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
Welcome back, everybody. We have a great episode today. We are talking with Scott Reisfield, who is the great nephew of Greta Garbo. But before we get further into the story of Scott and his relationship with his great aunt, we're going to give a shout out to our listener of the week. And this week, we're going to honor Doreen Weasel from New Jersey. So thank you, Doreen, for all the likes, all the comments. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, Scott, let's move into talking about some of the photographs that were taken of Garbo. In your book, you talk about Garbo changing portrait photography because she didn't just pose, right? She had this internal life, as we talked about in the first half, and was really acting for the camera. Can you talk about more about why those early portraits were such a turning point?
Yeah, photography was evolving too, like we were talking about film technology. Photography was evolving where they were getting better depth of field from the lenses, better lighting, and the photographers were evolving too. And where you had these traditional portraits, very posed, trying to replicate painted portraits, really. Garbo brought a very different feel to it, and the photographers she worked with had also photographed modern dance. So they were trying to capture something in modern dance that was, in their mind, different from portraits and different from landscapes. And with Garbo, it's really the first time I see where the two ideas are melded, where the emotion comes from the subject almost to the viewer without the photographer, like in a perfect art form. It's the subject communicating to the viewer. You get a little bit of it with the Henry Goodwin portraits from around Josta Berling. So you can see she's doing things a little differently than just sitting. But then with Genthe, it absolutely comes forth. And the thing that I didn't understand until I looked at the Genthe negatives at the Library of Congress, and all of, maybe not all, but his entire collection of negatives and prints he donated to the Library of Congress. It's an incredible.
Wow.
But you can look through all the portraits he was doing in the teens and 20s, and they're very formal. Even with actors where they're posed, they're rigid. And the Garbo portraits, out of nowhere, are these very emotional, connoting movement kinds of images. And then he goes back to his regular portraits.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is what Hollywood did with that. Ruth Harriet Louise, who was MGM's portrait photographer and maybe like 2 years older than Garbo, or maybe one, had trained with Nicholas Marai, who was a New York photographer who also did dance photographs. And so when Garbo got out to MGM, she starts doing these emotional poses with Louise. And they're in the book, but I found these interviews with Ruth Harriet Louise where, she's saying things like, well, Garbo has more than one facet. First, I tried to capture all of them in one photo, and I realized I would do better if I just took a facet at a time and made that the photograph. And that's what Garbo just does for the rest of her photographic career.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting because she created these photos for MGM and other photographers, and they sort of dominated photography in the first half of the 20th century. But there's also this set of photographs that Garbo did after World War II, and she wasn't making films, right? So all the Cecil Beaton portraits, the Hoyington Hume portraits, the Beauchamp portraits, the horse portraits are all done when she's not making film. But she's creating a photographic life for public consumption, even when she's not making film.
Which is so interesting because so many actors don't like the still camera. They feel confined by it or self-conscious. And she clearly found a way to really tell stories in both mediums, in front of a still camera as well as the moving camera.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I learned that I didn't understand at first. I mean, I thought they were great photos, but I didn't understand why. And it took a lot of reading to understand, oh, this is work. This is a photographer and a subject working at creating great photos.
Right.
Yeah.
George Hurrell is a great photographer. His photos of like Joan Crawford or Norma Shearer are really fantastic photos. He clearly didn't click with Garbo. Their photos are okay, and they didn't click as personalities either.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something that's created by both parties making photography work.
Yeah.
It's an intimate relationship, I think,
really
between subject and
is.
photographer.
It really is. Yeah.
One thing I loved about your book that you said that you really compared Garbo's impact on women with somebody like Taylor Swift. I think that's so dead on and so accurate. What do you think that most modern viewers underestimate about Garbo's impact on Hollywood and acting and all of these things?
I think it's her impact on the women of her time. Okay, she was a big star, but women really turned to her as an avatar of what was a woman. And it's a period of time where what a woman could do was still evolving. And I think that accessibility that she had, where people felt they understood her thoughts, what she was doing, what she was thinking, and the women she portrayed, who were all imperfect, and that's what makes the story go, right?
Yeah.
They find love, they find their inner truth. And I think her audience said, this is how you find that. You behave like Garbo in some way. And, this is one of the things I found only in research, because I didn't understand this before. The engagement that fans had, and, today engagement is online, but then it was you would send letters.
Yeah.
And she just received all these letters, thousands of letters, more than anybody else, and more than women in other fields who also received letters. The one I could find, I found it for Eleanor Roosevelt at a later year, because in 1930 she was not the wife of the president. I also found it in the way fan magazines covered her compared to other stars. There are no Q scores from back then, right? So I think that the number of mentions a fan received in photoplay, just to pick a magazine, was kind of a proxy of how important they were to the readership.
Yeah.
Right? Because these magazines wrote about who people wanted to read about. The funniest thing was one magazine apologized publicly for not writing a Garbo article.
That's fantastic.
But she would get just this incredible depth of coverage. And a lot of it was stupid or made up, but it was there.
Yes.
And it was beyond what anybody else was getting. And this is before paparazzi, newspapers were starting to write about celebrities, in the sense that there were columns about Hollywood.
Mhm.
The sort of celebrity Hollywood media coverage was still in its infancy outside of the fan magazines.
One thing, Scott, that I've always heard, and maybe you can clarify it, that Garbo never answered fan mail and she never signed autographs. Why do you think that was? Was it because she thought it was silly, or do you think it was just it was a calculated effort to create this mystery about her image?
Well, I think there were two things there. One is she did not need publicity.
Yeah, yes.
And in fact, people forget the negative side of publicity, especially back then. Now, celebrities kind of live in a parallel universe next to ours. And they're protected and insulated.
Yeah.
And she didn't. And in fact, to the degree that she could have, she opted to avoid that and to be more just an everyday person out walking the street. But there's always been the risk as a woman who's portraying sexual women on screen. There's always the risk of some guy deciding, you're his bride or whatever. And she had that. I mean, I do mention a couple of those.
Yes.
I don't know that I know all of them. I'm not quite sure what the benefit to Garbo would be of any additional publicity besides the fire hose she already had.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Other than it would have been maybe more genuine than the made up stuff.
Yes. Yes.
But I think the other piece of that is, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but if one were to answer all the letters she received in 1930, and it took 5 minutes to answer a letter, it would take a staff in their 20s to manage her.
Right.
So if she started picking up letters to answer the volumes of, that would be her career then.
Yeah.
Good point.
I think the same thing with signing the photos. And she did sign some for people along the way. It's not that she absolutely never did, but it would have become all-consuming.
Yeah.
And I think that's the piece of it that I think it's hard for people in a parasocial world to understand, is that, you're seeing the star and interacting with the star as one of you, and you think one of them. But from the other perspective, it's one of them and 20 million of you.
Scott, you touched on this a little bit, this idea that Garbo really redefined what a woman could do in the 20th century. In your view, what do you think is the most radical thing about the image that Garbo projected?
Imperfection.
That is
interesting.
Pretty wonderful.
Yeah. One thing too in your book, I know you sort of argue that films, especially films like Queen Christina, that they really started to challenge sexual and gender norms. Do you think that Garbo was aware of that when she made these choices about films that she took on? And was that part of, something that she wanted to portray?
Well, yeah, I think Salka Vertel wrote, I believe it was Salka, that when she and Thalberg discussed the lesbian kiss in Queen Christina that they took from another German film, she was like, yeah, let's do it. This will shake them up. I think that in the films that she filmed, they tend to be more women versus traditional values. And again, that imperfection, but then being pure of heart. And so that's why you love her. Some of the films she didn't make, there's more maybe gender bending. She was going to make a film about George Sand. So, in the United States, the McCarthy hearings start and the Lavender Scare allows a couple hundred homosexual people to lose their jobs. She's going to make a film about a cross-dressing woman.
Yeah.
So the film never got made, but those are the choices that she was making in the late 40s after the war that would have been nice to have seen on screen, but we never did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you think, Scott, she would have embraced the word feminism? Do you think she would have been a feminist?
I think she was a feminist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. Now, one thing too is I know that, again, in movies like Queen Christina, that she intentionally chose these roles because she liked to challenge this conservative nature in Hollywood,
Hmm.
that it was sort of purposeful, that some of her choices were. Do you think that this battle, which ultimately helped cause censorship to kind of grow in Hollywood against this, do you think that she would have been proud of those choices of just pushing the boundaries on censorship?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, it's interesting because we tend to focus on the sex aspect of Garbo films, with adultery and whether she's a sex worker or not. But in Queen Christina, she's a queen, right? And she has the men bowing down to her. And one of the complaints by the censors was that it was a horrible role model.
That's funny.
Well, do you think then that the conservatism that, with the Hays Code and everything that was starting to happen, do you think that that shortened her career?
Oh, absolutely. Because Two-Faced Woman, this is, again, research where I had a chance to really get into it. There wasn't anything about the film that was any more radical than even specific films that had been released a couple of months earlier. The Chocolate Soldier is almost the exact same plot with the same co-star, and it was fine. Two-Faced Woman was sort of a political choice to go after.
Yeah.
And it worked incredibly well for the Legion of Decency and Catholic conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
The films that didn't get made after World War II, some of them were choices, but two of them, there were other elements than censorship alone, but censorship certainly never got solved. So for Duchess de Langeais, the film that replaced George Sand, because they were going to make George Sand and they changed to a new project, just before the financing negotiations blew up, the PCA, Production Code Administration, sent Walter Wanger a letter and then a telegram telling him, we're not approving this script. And the letter's like 11 pages long of detailed reasons why they're not approving the script. And then when you get to the final project I could find that she had signed to do, which was The Miracle in 1955, they couldn't get an approved script.
Wow.
That's
Wow.
interesting.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. One thing about the book, Scott, that it really examines Garbo's relationships with powerful women, including Alla Nazimova, who was a member of the queer community of Hollywood. And this sort of started rumors that Garbo was part of the sewing circle, as they called it. What's your take on that? Was she just an ally, or do you think she was an active part of the community?
Well, I can't speak to what she did on any given night in her life. The relationships that were long term were with men.
Yeah.
And but I think she's absolutely an ally, and you see that in maybe some of the choices of the people she associated with. Again, some of the film choices, like the idea of doing George Sand. You're definitely stepping out into the area of sexuality that conservatives don't want to talk about.
Yeah.
It sounds to me like she was a boundary pusher, and I love that about her, that she loved to push the boundaries a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think to the degree that she used her celebrity to do anything, it was often to make women's lives a little easier by her action of crossing a boundary and having everybody accept it, and then everyone followed her.
Right. Which is such a wonderful part of her legacy. Scott, of all the discoveries that you made in the decade plus probably of research, right, that you did, what's the revelation that, I don't know, shocked you the most personally or surprised you the most personally?
I think how her relationship with the Production Code Administration was about censorship from the start.
Yeah.
From Queen Christina on. I didn't understand how much of a choice of hers Queen Christina was. To be honest, I originally thought that MGM picked it because she could have a Swedish accent and no one would care.
Exactly. I think a lot of people did. I think a lot of people
I think
did.
everyone thinks that.
But no, it came from discussions she had with Salka, and Salka was a very independent and strong woman on her own and wrote some great scripts. I mean, back then, no one wrote a script by themselves, but she framed out these stories, and they were women's stories. And then, as the Production Code Administration takes shape, and I got to give Thalberg a lot of credit for this too, because when Thalberg dies, she has more problems with stuff in an administrative sense, where Thalberg just made things happen because everybody trusted him to do it. But she made the costume dramas, Anna Karenina, Camille, and Conquest, and they are absolutely code challenging, except code people didn't understand how they were using it. It's this very subtle kind of judo of, the code's like, if you have to pay the ultimate price of death for your behavior, we win. And it's like, no, you don't.
Yeah.
Just flipped on you. The audience is with Garbo, not with you.
Yes.
Yeah, totally.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that's the piece that modern audiences understand. If you don't understand the context of the time, that you understand that those three roles are kind of subversive.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't even know that they seem strong when they actually are. That's how times change things.
Now, Scott, if you could offer up 3 movies that are the must-see movies from Greta Garbo, what would your 3 movies be?
Well, I think Camille and Ninotchka are my 2 favorite films.
Yes.
And then I would say I have to pick a silent because there's so many silent films.
Yeah.
And I think Joyless Street is a stunning film, especially the reconstructed version. That's almost 3 hours long. The versions that they created that were shorter focus on the Garbo story, but they lose the framework of the entire film, which is sort of like an Altman film. There are these parallel stories going on. It's a very feminist film. It's a very gritty film. It also had incredible censorship problems. And while Garbo is good in Josta Berling, she's just awesome in Joyless Street. And it's not just Garbo. You have Asta Nielsen, you have Werner Krauss. There's some great, great roles.
Yeah.
So to me, that is her. And I like a lot of the MGM silent films, but Joyless Street's pretty spectacular.
Yeah.
I've never seen it, so now I want to go
me
place out and see
too.
it.
Me too.
Sure, you get the long version.
Yeah.
Okay.
Version.
Scott, final question for you before we let you go. After all the time that you've spent in Ms. Garbo's life, what do you think she would want modern audiences to understand about her?
It's interesting because one of the things I realized as I was researching her is she did a set of interviews with a Swedish journalist who she knew was a journalist in the 1980s.
Okay.
So, and Sven Broman wrote a book, and it's a nice little book. But I think she was very clear that she didn't want to be totally forgotten. I think, she'd want to be remembered as someone who did good work, showing what women's lives could be.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. What a great way to end our conversation. This has been so fascinating. Scott, let our listeners know and our viewers know, where can they find your book and when is it going to be released?
Sure. The book will be available as an ebook, a paperback, a hardcover, and a large print in all of the normal retailers you can buy books from. So all the online platforms and all of the bookstores, because it's going to be distributed through Ingram, who distributes to bookstores. So if it's not at your bookstore, you can order it. And it's going to launch April 30th.
Perfect.
April 30th.
And I don't think we've actually said the name of the book.
We did. We said it once,
We did,
but,
okay.
but just to remind everybody.
Greta Garbo and the Rise of the Modern Woman.
Yeah.
Fantastic title.
I love
so
that.
We've read it, folks. It's a fantastic book.
It truly
Make
is.
sure you get this book. It's so good.
Yes. Before we let you go, we need to find the answer to this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz. I don't know, Scott, if you've got some ideas, but remind our listeners
Right.
what the question
The
was.
question was, Greta Garbo was the first Swedish woman to ever be nominated for an Academy Award. Who were the other 4 who came after her? Ingrid Bergman.
Yes.
Yes.
There was Anne Margaret.
Oh, of course.
Lena Olin, and the
Yes.
only one who actually won the award was Alicia Vikander, who won for The Danish Girl. So those were our
I
notice.
forgot that she was
Yeah,
Swedish.
he's Swedish. So
Yeah.
those were our Swedes. And
Okay.
only one man ever, one Swedish man ever,
And,
Max von Sydow.
of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. And listeners and viewers, thank you for joining us. We are so grateful for the time that you spend with us. We would love it if you would give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and subscribe. And you can follow us on social media. Our handle is @FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook.
And we love your emails. Please keep them coming. You can email us anytime at info@FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com.
That's this week's view.
From Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
You've been listening to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign with Steve Cubine and Ann McNamara, the podcast that celebrates amazing stories of Tinseltown from its golden era. Join us next week for another episode and learn something else about Hollywood you probably never knew. Take a moment and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review, and tell your friends about us too. It'll help grow the podcast. Visit Steve's website at FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. The executive producers are Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara. Executive producer and post-production supervisor Lindsay Schnebley. Associate producer and researcher John Price Ritchie. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like The Box of Oddities and The Shallow End with Schnebley and Toth. Copyright 2026, all rights reserved. That's a wrap.